Hello and welcome. You're listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast. Hosted by Elkan Abrahamson and Nicola Brook from Broudie Canter solicitors, the COVID Inquiry podcast has been designed to provide commentary, opinion, and key insights into the hearings from experts and those directly affected by the pandemic. Each week, Elkan and Nicola will be joined by guests to discuss events from the inquiry. Their interviews and conversations will bring you up to date on the implications of the evidential hearings in a readily accessible format and, most importantly of all, in plain English. This week, Elkan is joined by Lorelei King, actor, narrator, screenwriter and active member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. He's also joined by Enda McGarrity, one of the lead solicitors representing the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland branch in the COVID inquiry. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hi everyone, this is podcast number 3, which is covering week 3 of the COVID inquiry with a little bit of week 2 that we missed last time, and my fault entirely. I'm Elkan, and with me is...
I'm Lorelei King, a member of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice.
And it's the same voice as you heard last time. We're hoping to be joined by Enda, who will introduce himself later on in the podcast. So if we can start by looking at week 2, day 4, which was the day I missed, apologies, and had quite a few big hitters, actually.
We did. We had some of the scientists. We had Chris Whitty, we had Sir Patrick Vallance, and I think we started with Roger Hargreaves.
Yeah, and my note of him, and probably the pattern that I think we've discussed before, which is of the scientists being prepared to examine their actions and consider where they may have gone wrong far more than the politicians, for reasons that will probably be obvious to everyone. So we start with Hargreaves, who raised the question of whether we took civil protection seriously enough. And that's, again, a theme that I think has run through the whole inquiry. We try to save money. Are we going to spend money on what is in effect and is being referred to as an insurance policy, a very expensive insurance policy, but equally one that when it comes time to cash in can save you an awful lot of money, never mind looking at the lives that you're saving.
We should point out that Roger Hargreaves is the current director of the COBRA unit. He got, the thing that stood out for me from him was he got quite a, well, first of all, he's referring to his bureaucratic mind, but he got quite a grilling from Hugo Keith, the inquiry's KC, so much so that Lady Hallett stepped in to stop him kicking the puppy. I'm not sure what that was about.
I don't know either. It's hard to know why in some particular cases the council comes in hard and why in some other cases, which we'll get to, as soft as a blancmange, but there must be reasons behind that. There was another quote I've got, which I think you took from Hargreaves about new money. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. It was. He was complimented on it being a good summary of government spending. And he said, I think it would be fairly summarized as there's no new money. There might be less money. But if there are good proposals, who knows? There could be more money. That is kind of the honest answer on that point. The government is very good if it is spending money and telling you it is spending money. It is not spending money here. It is not spending more money here and might spend less. I mean, I don't know what that means. But apparently, Sir Hugo Keith thought it was a good summary.
It's about the battle with Treasury. Every time you want to do anything, you have to, even if you're at cabinet minister level, you have to get it past the Treasury. And the Treasury is very jealous of what it sees as its money. And that's why he says there's never any new money. The Treasury is never going to come and say, oh,
I'm sorry, are you talking about our money, Elkan?
Yes.
I don't actually think it is the Treasury's money.
But they won't offer you the money. So you've got to come along with a really good idea, ideally an idea which saves money. And actually, in this case, we come back to the insurance policy. It actually does save money in the long run, investing in proper resilience framework. And it, as almost a byproduct, it improves the lives of everyone before you have to claim against your insurance policy. So it seems to me a complete no-brainer. But having said that, government always has lots of demands on it. are they going to pay for an insurance policy that they're not going to have to cash in on their watch? And that's always the calculation they make.
They calculate.
Yeah, and we suffer for that.
We suffer for that. I agree. Then we had a figure we came to know incredibly well during the pandemic, who is Chris Whitty.
Right, and quite sad evidence coming from him about him and his family facing personal abuse, which is just unpardonable. And the fear is that it will drive scientists away from participating in the public body. Why should they, if they can potter away at some university as a chair and get a very nice salary, thank you very much, and live a quiet life? Why should they expose themselves to that sort of abuse? And we live in a society where if you put your head up against a parapet one way or another, you are going to be abused. And it's just awful.
And Lady Hallett actually broke off to reinforce that point. And I know that she in her career once, she mentioned it on Desert Island Discs, I believe she had been in her position as a lawyer defending someone that the family of the victims, I guess, weren't happy about it, and she was personally attacked. It is awful. And I felt for Sir Chris Whitty when he was saying those things.
Yeah, and the evidence he gave, one of the points he said was that scientists wouldn't think about lockdown without being asked. And that's worrying, especially in the context of the narrative that we're being given, which is that scientists are always very challenging of each other and they love being challenged, and that's how they produce new thoughts and new ideas. But then to say, but we won't think outside the box unless a minister asks us to. I find that quite worrying, actually.
And did he say? Well, I think he did say that there needed to be more radical in approach. We needed to be more radical in our approach,
without a doubt. Which sort of contradicts what he was saying about them not thinking about things. And he repeated again a line that has emerged again and again. Not enough thought was given to stopping COVID.
In this next section, Elkan and Lorelei are joined by Enda McGarrity to discuss how he, his team, and his clients are feeling about the inquiry's progress so far, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland issues. Enda is from PA Duffy and is one of the lead solicitors representing the Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group in Northern Ireland at the COVID inquiry.
Elkan and I are really glad to have Enda McGarrity with us. Enda, you represent the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland. I'm a member of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I know that you were very worried that the handling of Northern Ireland by this inquiry was going to be a footnote. Can you tell us about that? How do you think it's going so far? I know it's early days.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Very, very glad to be here. So one of the mantras from our group from the very outset was that there was a fear that Northern Ireland could become a footnote in a UK-wide inquiry. Now, we've been at pains to stress that, both in preliminary hearings and through the opening statements. And we've been trying to play as active a role as possible in the early stages of the inquiry. So by that, I mean we've been submitting questions in conjunction with the UK group, and a really extensive amount of work and under prohibitive timelines and deadlines as well. So the way it has played out so far, as many will know, is that we've been allowed a very limited amount of questions. So, and that in some instances the questions have been amended or changed. So it's far from ideal, and the treatment has not been good, to be frank. I think our optimal way of assisting the inquiry would be for us as representatives to the bereaved to question witnesses directly on discrete points that we have raised, and there are many. So in fairness, some of the points are being raised by counsel to the inquiry, but again, we don't feel like this is the optimal way to do things. And we would hope that would change, but at the moment it doesn't look likely.
I think our lawyers are finding the same problem with that. I know that in Northern Ireland, you one of the reasons is you say you have specific regional needs. What are some of those?
Yeah, so we, in relation to Module 1 in particular, we have set out about 10 core themes And we're similar to some of the other devolved nations, but in many respects very, very different. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the fact that the island of Ireland is a single epidemiological unit. So preparedness and resilience strategies should be necessarily different. So that slightly changes our arguments compared to other nations. Another sort of discrete issue is that we did not have a government in the 3 years leading up to the pandemic, which is of great concern to a lot of our clients. And I think concerningly, in the Department for Health's opening statement, they made reference to the fact that the absence of an Northern Ireland executive had no impact on preparedness plans, which is obviously rejected wholeheartedly by us and our clients. So those are some of the key themes that we're seeking to raise, and that we feel are extremely relevant, and set Northern Ireland aside a little bit from other countries in a UK context.
I know that my husband died in a care home, so it's a particular area of interest of mine. And I know that you say there's been a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on care home residents in Northern Ireland, and that's a matter of great concern to you.
Yeah, of course. One of our group leads, Martina Ferguson, her mother died in a care home tragically, and that has been the case with many of our members. So it's been at the forefront of our minds since the moment we've been instructed in this case. And while it seems that they want to silo care homes into future modules, as you well know, there are issues in Module 1 which relate to care homes. Take for the example of austerity and the impact that may have had on staffing levels and funding for public care homes in Northern Ireland in this instance.
And do you thought as well, the theme that keeps coming up again and again is the exit from the EU,
yes,
which also will have had an impact.
Yeah, of course. And another thing that has been raised by the authorities in Northern Ireland in their opening statements, particularly the Department of Health, where they have said that EU exit planning actually left Northern Ireland in a better place to respond to a pandemic, which again, completely reject that. And we've heard this week in some of the evidence about how Operation Yellowhammer, which is the EU exit strategy, assisted with things like supply chains for medical products. But that is an attempt, we feel, to distract from the much larger and more profound impacts on all other aspects of health and social care. And, you know, it's an argument that we'll be strongly making, hopefully, to the Northern Ireland witnesses.
Mm-hmm. And how many people do you represent from Northern Ireland?
There's roughly about 200 members of the Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice group, come from all sections of society in relation to loved ones who have died at all ages. I think the youngest bereaved was 24 in our group, so very tragic. And as you well know, there's hundreds of tragic stories throughout the UK, thousands in fact.
Well, I know the COVID Bereaved Families UK feel a great affinity with the bereaved families of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this shared goal, which is very important between the groups. And yeah, long may it last. Long
may it last, because I think what all of us want is for things to be different in the future. What all of us want is change.
Yeah,
accountability, of course, but mostly change.
Absolutely. And one of the core goals of our group is to achieve some form of legislative reforms, some in relation to care homes, some in relation to other matters. So that would be a really optimal outcome for our group.
In the next part of this podcast, Elkan, Lorelei and Enda discuss week 3 of the evidential hearings.
Well, so now we're on to week 3. So, Elkan.
So I'm going to whiz through day 1, or at least part of day 1. The first witness, I think, was Emma Reid, Deputy Director of the DHSC, Department of Health and Social Care. She says she was not told that it was considered that the system would be overwhelmed by even a moderate pandemic. She thought the flu strategy had been tested through Cygnus and there was a work programme to address enhancement. the 2011 strategy document was referred to, and it said the UK government did not plan to close borders, stop mass gatherings, or impose controls on public transport during any pandemic. She was not aware of any of this being questioned, and she made the point, which again has been made throughout, that no-deal preparations, in other words, what's called Operation Yellowhammer, preparing for a no-deal Brexit, took precedence over along the other work that was being done, in particular the work that's relevant to us, which was preparing for a pandemic.
And that was Emma Reid, Director of Emergency Preparedness and Health Protection at the Department of Health and Social Care. Is that true?
Yeah. And then we get to Rosemary Gallagher.
Yeah, she was interesting.
And I think interesting because she's from the RCN, Royal College of Nursing, so she's outside the system and is able, therefore, to be more critical. And she was the, if I have this right, professional lead for infection prevention and control. And the first thing, well, one of the notes that I've got, which I found shocking, was there was a shortage of 50,000 nurses going into the pandemic.
Yeah.
And in that context of having slack and resilience, and what we had was the exact opposite. We had a shortage, never mind spare capacity.
Yeah, she said when they needed surge capacity to support patients who were infected at home or in hospitals, they just didn't have it.
Yeah. She said they weren't involved in pandemic planning. She said lessons should have been learned from MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Their engagement as stakeholder was significantly reduced from 2017, and you get the impression that they just didn't have an involvement in government planning.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think it's the Royal College of Nursing who were there on the front line.
That's it. She said there was a complete lack of engagement.
Yeah.
Well, were you aware, Enda, that it was such a shortage of 15,000? I didn't know that. I hadn't known that.
One of the interesting things from a Northern Ireland perspective, which came out in Rosemary Gallagher's evidence, was the mention of strikes, nursing strikes in December 2019 and January 2020. So right before the pandemic struck, and the impact that would have had on general preparedness. And I think there was a nod to austerity as well.
Yeah.
And just on that, it's interesting talking about strikes, isn't it, that the Royal College of Nursing has just had a ballot on another strike. And although the majority of those who voted in favour of another strike, because the amount of people who voted wasn't enough, I think it has to be 50% or over, it didn't amount to a mandate for striking. So what you've got now is a workforce returning to work, but thoroughly disenchanted, which is the worst of all possible.
Absolutely, and disheartened, I imagine. And then next up we had Dame Jenny Harris.
Yeah, it was very Damien Professor, I thought, wasn't she?
Yes.
So Chief Executive of the UK Health Security Agency and NHS. They've all got massive titles.
She was a former deputy chief medical officer, wasn't she?
Yeah.
During the time of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I recall seeing her up at that lectern quite a few days.
And there were other things she said, a few in particular I noted. One comment she made is that the evidence base is often in a completely different direction to political will. And what I got from that is basically the politicians are doing the wrong thing all the time, for financial reasons probably, or whatever reasons. But it's not enough, in other words, to have a solid evidence base to show what needs to be done. You've also got to persuade the politicians.
Yeah, she also referred to cuts, and just how it had, she said the overall impact of budget cuts was quite significant, which is not surprising. What did you think?
Yeah, one of the things that came out of it, as well as the usual topics of the week, such as austerity and things like that, was the impact on the most vulnerable in society. And there were some concessions on that in relation to health inequalities. And I think effectively they conceded that the poorest areas were impacted the worst, which is something that we know, of course, but it's always useful to hear that in evidence.
I think on our side, we always like to hear concessions, don't we? I mean, I'm told that's a good thing. Is that right, Elkan?
Yeah. The other thing she mentioned was this idea of what she called the wicked issues, two wicked issues, which I think she meant difficult issues to grapple with. One was port entry and quarantining, and the other was scaling up massive response testing.
Yeah.
I think there are quite a few other wicked issues that we've come across, but maybe we'll get to that. Few wicked witnesses, but we'll get to that later. Talking of which,
Yes.
the next witness is Matt Hancock.
Oh, don't get me started. Don't get me started. This is a witness that I was most keen to see and most dreaded seeing because, as I said, I lost my husband, Vincent Kerr, and I almost didn't come. I didn't know if I could take it. As it was, I did go and held up photographs of my husband's coffin. I wanted him to see them, and he did not disappoint in his testimony. He was everything I expected.
And I think from your personal point of view, he's quite a distressing witness to hear from.
He was a distressing witness to hear, and I hardly even know where to begin. He started by saying, I'm emotionally committed to making this inquiry a success. Well, I don't believe it, because otherwise he would have been more forthcoming. Just the overall picture I have of him is that it was all blaming everyone else. He was responsible for nothing. The language he used, I was assured, I was told, I was reassured. Elkan, you made a really interesting distinction between assured and reassured.
Yes, so in government speak, they're two completely different concepts. Reassurance means someone I trust has told me that the system is working and I accept what they say. In other words, I'm prepared to rely on someone else. Assurance means I've been provided with verifiable data, usually from a number of sources, which I can triangulate, in other words, to make sure that they all tell me the same story. And on the basis of that, I have assurance that what I'm being told is correct. Now, all the politicians have used those two words interchangeably. Counsel to the inquiry has not picked up on that because he's not familiar with government speak. I often get this impression that it's like two different worlds talking to each other. The lawyers are using legal terms, politicians are using political terms, and then you've got the experts using medical terms, and we're not sharing a common language, and that comes up quite a few times. That the word groupthink, I think, means different things to different people again, and because we're not exploring that, we're not always, when we think we've reached an agreed position, we haven't necessarily, and that's quite worrying. But especially for assurance and reassurance, because I don't know whether Hancock was saying, I was given all the data, and on the basis of that, I made a decision, in which case, what data was he given? Or is he saying, Fred down the hall in my trust told me everything was fine and dandy, and I believed it?
Yeah, this is it. I wasn't aware of this distinction. It's interesting. With him, who knows, because he's quite slippery. I did think he was very much trying to take control. He was trying to steer the dialogue to what his areas of comfort, for example, vaccines, which, as I think we've said, the received wisdom is that was something that was handled well. We're not sure we all agree, and he was taken away from that by Hugo Keith, of course, who wouldn't have it. And I could see him getting more and more frustrated as he couldn't direct the conversation. And I watched his neck, where we sit in the bereaved family sit in the public gallery. I can see the side of his neck. And although his face looks serene, the neck, same with David Cameron, turns red anytime it's a question he doesn't like. And when he was thwarted, as he was often, he became almost rude. He became uncommunicative, like a teenager, almost to the point of rudeness. And at one point I was watching the transcript. He started answering, nope. And yet the transcript would say no. I think they should write nope, because it's significant. It means something.
Absolutely. That was my impression as well. And I think it's a very different thing to come on to the inquiry and to hold your hands up and to give sort of this impression that you're genuine and you want to make peace with families. It's a very different thing then in your evidence to go and not accept any fault. And there was very little regard for the impact that would have on people like yourself and
I'm sure. And he gave an apology from his seat at the witness stand. And he said at that point, I'm not comfortable talking about my emotions. Well, I'm afraid we all saw him on television talking about his emotions when he left his wife and family for another woman because he was in love. He seemed to speak about his emotions quite freely. But again, it seemed insincere. It rang untrue. And also, I'm personally not receptive to it, and I don't think anyone there was.
I think what proved it was untrue is that when he was in the witness box, making his apology to the families and looking at the families, and he said, I want to say how sorry I am. I understand you may not want to hear this apology from me. And then as soon as he finished giving evidence, he goes down to the public gallery and almost confronts the bereaved because he wants to give an apology because it makes him feel better.
Elkan, I cannot tell you how shocked we were. We were sat with our photographs of our loved ones in our laps, and we saw him walking toward us. Normally the witnesses sort of hive off. They have a particular exit they go through. He came toward us, and the horror that we felt, it's very difficult to convey what that feels like when he's bearing down on us. So we instinctively, most of us, turned our backs. And one of our members, I felt so bad, didn't turn in time, and she said something to him like, don't show your face, or no, just it was a no. And then she turned, and she was trembling, and she was sobbing afterwards. It was heartbreaking to see. And I just don't understand. He arrived. I cannot tell you the security. Well, you will have seen it. He arrived with all these police, all these bodyguards. They protected him. We are not allowed to approach him on the witness stand, yet he is perfectly able to accost us. And he didn't have the wit to realize how unwelcome that overture was. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. You're so right, and I think it's revealing of the man he is. There are a couple of things he said in evidence. So I was saying he created this elephant in the room of what he called the doctrinal flaw in planning, which assumed that a large number of deaths was going to take place rather than trying to prevent those deaths taking place. He wasn't the first person or the last person to mention that. But having sort of created this elephant, he spent the rest of the time cowering behind the elephant. So that every time he was asked about anything else, he'd go, yes, but the really important thing is this doctrinal flaw in planning. And yes, it's important, but that doesn't excuse you from discussing the other things that went wrong. And his attitude was, I take responsibility for everything. I was a senior person in that department, but I didn't do anything wrong. And it's just quite hard to reconcile that. One important thing I thought he said, among a few things actually, he said, we didn't know how many care homes there were in the UK. And when you think about he's talking about the ring of steel he created around these care homes, and he didn't even know how many there were.
That was a shocking admission.
Yeah, really was, wasn't it? He said there were only 2 local authority plans for preparedness in social care, which is something we haven't heard from anywhere else. And I don't know if it's correct or not, but if it is correct, it's quite worrying.
Well, yeah, he said there were no coherent plans for adult social care in place, but it's like he was the Secretary of State. I don't know. And how long have they been in power? I didn't understand. How did you...
Of course, one of the big takeaways for me was the connection established between exercise sickness, the EU exit strategy, and the ultimate problems that occurred during COVID. So he came into office in 2018. He realised that there was a gap in some of the recommendations that arose from exercise sickness, which was, of course, the simulation which identified major flaws in the UK's preparedness plans. So in order to remedy that, he set up the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board, and their role was to implement the recommendations which had not been implemented. Fast forward a year roughly, and Operation Yellowhammer, the EU exit plan, overtook that, and the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board took a backseat effectively. So we got an insight into that and how those wheels were set in motion. He approved the Pandemic Readiness plan, and then it was overtaken by Operation Yellowhammer.
Didn't he say as well that when it was pointed out that the recommendations from Cygnus hadn't been implemented, and he said, well, I've seen them, they wouldn't have done any good.
Yeah, he did say that.
One other comment he made, another shocking comment, he said, I've got it word for word, imagine if this disease had tragically killed children as much as it did old people, and maybe it transmitted twice as easily as COVID. Would it then be possible to halt the spread? And of course it would. We'd do whatever it took, and that's where we got to, but we got there far too slowly. In other words, old people don't really matter.
I know.
But if it had affected children, no.
What if it affected people that really matter?
Yeah. What an appalling thing to say.
lack of insight as well. And as you've referenced already, the people sitting in the room knew that all too well.
Yeah, it was hard to hear. And I think he also seemed to be wanting to, in addition to taking control of the conversation, he wanted to set himself up as somehow going to be part of fixing it. And like as I said, he wants to be involved in plans to rebuild the house he helped burn down, telling us how it should be done. He had an example. He said every healthcare facility should have its own PPE paid for by the government. But it was like, when did he take his position? 2018.
Yeah, of course. And I suppose to elaborate on that point, there's limitations in to what extent Module 1 can examine what he has done. So it seems like there's many more bad days to come for Mr. Hancock.
I think you're right.
So should we move on?
Yes.
Duncan Shelby.
I'm afraid at that point, I was not able to listen to anything more. So I'm over to you.
So he was the Chief Executive of Public Health England, 2012 to 2020. And he came up with the concept of syndemic, which I hadn't heard before.
Love that.
Which was a sort of synthesis of pandemics, I guess. He said it's a pandemic combined with a poor state of health of the nation. In other words, and again, coming back to the concepts we've been hearing about, we had poor resilience, so we weren't really able to deal as well as we could have done with a pandemic, however prepared we might have been otherwise. But actually we weren't prepared either. That's two sets of problems that interacted. And the other thing I've got that he said was that there's never been any discussion at any point with anyone about the scale of pandemic that we faced. In other words, it was not just completely unforeseen, but completely unplanned for. And talking about unforeseen, that's another message that the politicians, I think, are trying to get across as sort of who would have thought, who could possibly have expected it, which A, is wrong anyway, given the history of diseases, MERS and SARS and so on. And B, even if it were right, we still had a few months advance notice that it was coming. It was creeping its way across the world to us, and we could see that happening and just ignored it.
He made one small comment about relations with the devolved nations, and it's something we've heard over the last few weeks in evidence. He mentioned that there was networks for health protection, and that Public Health England was like the mothership in that regard. In that it had certain capabilities that you couldn't replicate everywhere, i.e. you couldn't replicate in the devolved nations. So we've heard this over and over, that there are some informal relationships and ongoing conversations between officials in each nation. Unfortunately, there's very little evidence that proves that this was constructive, and it's something that our clients are very aware of, that disconnect between central government and devolved governments, and how that might have fed into some of the on-the-ground issues at the beginning of the pandemic in particular.
Must be very frustrating for them to hear this. Yeah, I can imagine.
Should we skip to Jeremy Farrow, the World Health Organization? Again, someone who had no real skin in the game, to use an awful phrase, so wasn't protecting his own actions, so was better able to be neutral. And one of the things he said was that we live in a pandemic age. We are going to have more pandemics, and we've heard that again and again. And I'm not sure. We also talk about an insurance policy, but you do wonder, it's not the kind of insurance policy that you're never going to claim on. It's the kind of insurance policy where you get to have to claim on repeatedly. And we really need to be aware of that. Lorelei, I think you mentioned he used the phrase Swiss cheese model.
He did. He testified today,
yeah.
Thursday. I liked it. He was talking about masks in particular, and about how they may not be this effective or whatever. And I think people tend to pull apart each element and say, well, masks don't work that well, or social distancing doesn't work that well. And his point, which was a good one, is that they mesh together, but meshed together they're very strong. A reed on its own isn't strong. Weave it together with some others and you have something much better. So I did like that.
That's a much better analogy, because when he says Swiss cheese model, I think it's full of vowels.
I think that too, because I liked what he was saying, and I thought, but why is it Swiss cheese?
of course, very, very interesting witness, and it's always good to hear experts like this talk about drawing on comparisons from other nations, and in this instance, it was some of the Asian countries which he pointed to, in particular Vietnam, and back to the issue of face masks. He thought that the uptake in the wearing of face masks was much better in Vietnam, and that was probably due to foresight, that might have been something that was wise to do.
It's not just that. I used to live in Hong Kong, and you'd regularly see people wearing face masks. If they have a cold in the Far East, they'll wear a face mask. So it's accepted behaviour, and it's interesting how powerful that is. When no one else, let's say in England or Northern Ireland, is wearing a face mask, you feel really awkward, and you feel silly wearing one if you're the only person wearing it. Whereas in the Far East, you don't, because it's a common and accepted behaviour. And even in a matter of life and death, this idea of feeling a bit silly controls our own behaviour.
That's very English, if you don't mind my saying that as an outsider.
Yeah, I think, and that's actually been pointed to a couple of times, the notion of British exceptionalism and the idea that there's different ideologies in the West and the East in relation to these types of things, and these experts really interestingly reflect on that.
I know we had day 2, but I just wonder if briefly we should touch on day 3, when we had a lot of people from the Scottish government testifying. For me, the thing that I took away from that was their own exercises, Silver Swan and Iris, that, again, the recommendations not implemented, something we hear again and again.
It was absolutely more of the same, wasn't it? No difference at all. Just with the overlay of lack of cooperation between the devolved nations and the UK centre.
We found it quite interesting as a comparator to Northern Ireland. So while, yes, more of the same, they didn't follow through, they did do something in that they had the exercises where, as in Northern Ireland, there was very little done, particularly in that 3-year period before the pandemic struck, when, as I said, there was no government in place.
And back to today, we had another big witness this morning.
Ms. Sturgeon.
Yes, Nicola Sturgeon, former...
She was a big witness. Sorry for speaking out here. She was a big witness, but I didn't think said a lot, and I didn't think she was given at all a hard time. I think she was given a very easy ride. It would have been interesting to hear more about what she thought about the relationship between Scotland and the UK central government. I didn't really get anything from her on that. That was very useful. Talking about Brexit, which must have been particularly annoying for her, because as with the UK, resources were diverted to deal with a no-deal Brexit, and was it 98% of people in Scotland had voted against? So
I think it was 80, but yeah.
80, was it? So yeah, I mean, I would have thought she would have found that particularly infuriating, but I didn't really get that sense from her. It wasn't drawn out from her as much as it could have been, I think.
Well, no. In fact, it might have been pushed back in when Hugo Keith said, this is a witness box, not a soapbox.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I understand why it's not appropriate for her to vent, but I think it is appropriate for her to talk about the factual differences and the implications of the relationship between Scotland and central UK government. And I would have personally liked to hear a bit more about that.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, you guys are, but I thought that too was relevant, I thought.
Yes.
And we were waiting with bated breath to hear about that, again, as a comparator and to how Northern Ireland have handled things. And I thought it was interesting. They mentioned one thing about how party politics can sometimes affect those types of communications between central government and devolved nations. And I think from a Northern Ireland perspective, that's certainly something that we will want to look at. I believe that comment came from Jeremy Hunt during his evidence.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us today, and we'll be seeing a lot more of you, I hope. And talk to us again.
Yeah, of course. Of course, happy to talk. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. Elkan, Nicola and the team at Broudie Jackson Canter are looking forward to bringing you more expert commentary, opinion and insight next week as the COVID Inquiry hearings continue.